about the meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden. Professor Chen, when you look back at the G20, what was the most significant outcome from that gathering of the two leaders? And what would you say is the message that they jointly conveyed to a world that is... 对不起，我再来一遍。Professor Chen, when you look back at the G20 and the meeting between the two leaders, what would you say is the most significant outcome and the message that they send to a world that is in trouble?
Well, I think the most important critical outcome from the Xi-Biden summit on the sideline of G20 is the restarting, the resumption of a regular in-person communication, which I hope will lead up to a more re-engagement between two governments, as well as between the two societies. So as we have observed that following the two presidents' first in-person meeting in the past 3 years, and their commitment to empowering their work teams, respectively, to keep on the communications. The defense ministers' meetings was carried out in Cambodia on November 22nd. And then we are also, the Chinese side, Beijing, is also expecting Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States, to visit Beijing early next year. And a more regular face-to-face official dialogues of various portfolio between two countries will follow up. And more than that, a wide range of communications, dialogues, and engagements will be resumed or revived between two societies, including a more intensive and extensive in-person interaction between the two intellectual communities. So I think these are the most important outcome, as well as the most important message coming out of the summit meeting.
Well, they also agreed that a strategic framework is needed to guide future bilateral relations. What would be the guiding principles of such a framework?
Well, I think that as we have observed that the leaders of two countries have committed to work out a framework and a shared principle to govern the bilateral relationship, including how to manage the differences and the competition in a constructive and a non-confrontational way, and how to expand the cooperation on those global and transnational challenges. I think that the summit also gave us a kind of a reassurance to the international community that both governments are willing and able to take China-US relationship back into its stability track. With regarding to what you said, principles, I think at least 3 sets of principles we should consider them in a very serious way. One is the mutual respect, each other's core interest, particularly regarding the sovereignty and the territorial integrity, as well as the fundamental concerns, including the political and economic security. Number 2, the second principle, I think very important, is the mutual agreement to non-confrontational manner in dealing with the differences and competition, including keeping the efficient communication and setting up the workable crisis avoidance or crisis management mechanism. And number 3, the third principle I think is very important, is the mutual commitment to expand the cooperation on those global threats and transnational challenges, including climate change, pandemic, and food and energy supply chain, etc. So I think this is some of those principles in my mind, which I believe are very critical. If we could apply them to governing our relationship, it will definitely help in making this relationship much more stable and predictable.
Well, such a framework could take time to build. So in the meantime, what are the steps that one can take to slow or perhaps stop the decline in the bilateral relationship?
Well, I think that it is always easier to say than to be done. My best knowledge is the first and foremost step both sides should take, have already taken, is to resume the dialogues and engagement across the board between the two sides, from governmental to non-governmental, from political, economic, military to cultural domains. The purpose is to dispel the estrangement between the two peoples, to break the echo chamber within each societies, and to mitigate the negative impact from misperception and miscalculation between two sides. I think one of the key takeaways from Xi-Biden summit is to resume the dialogue and to work on the principles dealing with the bilateral relationship. We know that both sides have a huge gap of perception on what those principles are, and let alone the difficulties in the future on how to apply them on the ground. But nevertheless, the good start itself is encouraging and auspicious. So this is, I think, the first step. The second, in my mind, is to strengthen the resilience of the bilateral cooperation mechanism. By saying the resilience of bilateral cooperation mechanism, I mean that given the fact that both sides still are in a huge shortage of trust, of confidence between Beijing and Washington. And therefore, those lack of trust between two sides has eroded the momentum and the willingness of bilateral cooperation on many transnational global challenges. So both sides should have enough sensitivities to others' core national interests. So while we talk today, we talk about setting up the firewall or railways or set the floor to prevent the further deterioration between two sides. I think that both sides need to work hard to prevent the dealing with the differences from choking the effort of maintaining the necessary cooperation, particularly on those global challenges. But whether this framework is workable and reasonable, I think that one rule in my mind, which I believe is very important, is not let those so-called competition cross the red line, which other side would interpret it as the existential threat to its core national interests. So I think that's very important.
Well, Professor Chen, you've already described this as an auspicious meeting, a good meeting, one that resets the relationship. But may I also ask you whether it sets in stone and in some way underlines this pattern of rivalry and unhealthy competition that we've seen over the past couple of years?
Excuse me, could you repeat your question?
Oh, it was the same question that I gave you on the paper. I said, Professor Chen, you described this as a good and auspicious meeting, one that resets the relationship, but does it also underline the competition and in some instances unhealthy rivalry between the two?
Well, I don't think that it is possible for both sides to reset the bilateral relationship. Because by referring to reset, it means that both sides can...
对不起，我说错了，我应该说 restart. You said restart, right?
Yes, restart.
对，我应该说这样的。let me change my word then. Okay. Professor Chen, you've already described this as a good and auspicious meeting that restarts the relationship, but does it also in some way re-establish the pattern of competition and in some cases unhealthy rivalry that we've seen over the past couple of years?
Yes, as I said, that those principles and those dialogues, which has been already initiated between two sides at the top level summit meeting, as well as those most senior minister levels, including their Secretary of State of the United States and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi's, their meeting, as well as those senior officials meeting between the two DODs. Those steps and those patterns of communication have already, to some extent, to help prevent a further deterioration, largely because I think through those in-person dialogue, in a frequent, a normal, and a regular way, if we can expect that, then I think it will avoid a huge miscalculation. That is the most important thing, because I think that if there's no in-person dialogue on a regular institutional base, there will be more likely that we will see a lot of echo chamber within two governments, and those miscalculations will also be amplified if those direct communication dialogue will not be carried out. So I think that's most important.
Well, as you and I know, trust and confidence are essential to any good relationship, and the same goes, of course, for China and the United States. As we've said, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, will be in Beijing probably in the next couple of weeks. And then we've also got joint work restarting on climate change. Are these enough? Are these the conditions that are necessary to growing that trust and confidence that we look for?
Well, we have to be realistic, because I think the biggest change or a climate change taking place between two sides is the deterioration of the bilateral relationship, and also is the result of the lack of direct communication. So the trust between two sides is extremely low. This is the reality. This is the situation that we have to deal with. So it is impossible for us, or it is unrealistic for us to have only one or two rounds of dialogue, even at the top level or at senior minister levels, would help revive all those kind of trust. I think the most important thing to revive the trust is not that how high the trust it is, but is that we should target the threshold of those trust.
Professor Chen, carry on.
We should just target at those a lowest level of trust, which means that it will prevent both sides from miscalculating each other's core interests, and therefore to make those relationships further deteriorated. So I think that as long as there's a minimum level of trust, which based upon a basic understanding of the core interest of each other, that is the most important thing.
Professor Chen, let's look at the G20 more generally. What did you make of this meeting? And do you think it was more than just a gathering of major leaders?
Well, I think that as we all know, for many years, G20 is the primary platform of global economic governance. At the same time, we also recognize that there are a huge headwinds confronting the global economic governance, including G20. Having said that, the 50 plus points of shared concerns, as well as the joint commitments by G20's leaders, have shown that international cooperation and collective action, rather than fragmentation or polarizations, which we have seen on the rise, are desperately needed to respond to growing number of global challenges. So this is the sign, as I observe, this is the sign of growing resistance to the anti-globalization and exclusiveness, which are, I think these days are very prevailing, but I think that we have already seen the growing sign of resistance to this anti-globalization. It's encouraging. And also on G20, as you have, both of us have known, we have recognized that we have observed that President Xi reiterated the international cooperation initiative on global food security and also expressed Beijing's support for the African Union in joining G20. So this proposal by President Xi for international cooperation have been very well received in G20 leaders' declaration. So I think these are all very important outcomes.
Let's talk now about one of the biggest global challenges today, which is, of course, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine that's moving now into its 10th month. A lot of people are wondering, what does China really think about this conflict? And is there now a limit to the so-called no-limit partnership that China has with Russia?
Well, I think Beijing's position on the war in Ukraine has been persistent and balanced. By saying persistence, I mean Beijing think United Nations Charter should be observed, and the member states' sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected. And there's no winner of war, particularly there's no winner of war among the big powers from those confrontations. And the international community should focus on bringing the conflicts or the war to the end through negotiation as much as they can. So this is what I understand of persistence of Beijing's position. By saying balanced, I mean Beijing has long pointed out that security is indivisible and the legitimate security of one party should be also respected. And to build up a balanced and inclusive security architecture in Europe is the only sustainable way of making peace and stability in Europe, as well as the European relationship with Russia. So this is the context in which the so-called no-limits partnership with Russia should be understood. So I think that when we talk about the no-limit partnership with Russia, it should be contextualized. And this is the context I think we can understand this statement by Beijing vis-a-vis its relationship with Russia.
Many of the global headlines were focused on what was unfolding at the G20 in Indonesia. But of course, right after that, there was a major gathering of leaders at the APEC meeting in Thailand. When you look at both, was there any difference in the way President Xi Jinping exercised his diplomacy in those two gatherings?
Well, that's a very good question. But as a matter of fact, when I compare these two big gatherings of the leaders, of global leaders, regional leaders, regional countries' leaders, I don't think there's a significant differences in President Xi's diplomacy between the two big gatherings. But rather, I have seen a more similarities. I think why? Number one, on both occasions, President Xi has play a very important role to try to increase the understanding of China, including understanding of China's national strategies towards the international community. And two, President Xi is try his effort to present China's initiative and proposal to address global and regional development and stability, including many transnational challenges, advocating for the inclusiveness, unity, and cooperation. And the third, President Xi also spared no effort to try to further enhance China's ties with members of all these two groups. So I think that when I check these two important gatherings of leaders where President Xi were all present, I have seen more similarity. Of course, given the different priority and the different members' presence of these two gatherings, there's a different the tone as well as the focal points of China's stress and priority in President Xi's proposal for these two meetings. But anyway, I have seen a more similarity and continuity in Xi's diplomacy on these two important summits.
The global backdrop is very complex, not only Ukraine, but of course the ongoing pandemic, a declining world economy, and of course food shortages and a looming energy crisis. Does APEC have the will, the resources, and the mandate to at least try and provide some of the resolutions to the problems that we as humanity face?
Well, yeah, you're right that we do face many difficulties ahead of us, and all those difficulties and challenges you raised are still there, are the more obstacles. I think these all consist of the huge headwinds for APEC leaders' commitment for regional connection, opening, and the balance. In particular, I think there are two difficulties or challenges standing out in this context. One is the tension and the conflicts coming from the different roadmaps for international, inter-regional, and trans-regional cooperation. In my mind, RCEP and CPTPP on one side, which are supported by China as well as many Asia-Pacific countries. I think these two roadmap for intra-regional and trans-regional cooperations has already played a very important role to help integrating the regional economic cooperation in Asia-Pacific. But on the other side, and the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, initiated by the United States, which I believe is too much ideology-based, and it has actually serves to disrupt rather than to integrate the regional economic integration as well as a supply chain. So I think that these different kind of roadmaps in the futures will be in a very intense competition, but I do not know the prospect of the competition, outcome of the competition. The other challenge is, as you said, that the capacity, whether those countries in the region has enough capability to deal with these challenges. I think that for those, particularly for those developing countries, which are repeatedly hit by the pandemic, the disruption of the food and supply, they have more challenges than the developed economies to carry out their obligations in fulfill their commitments. Frankly speaking, I think they have a huge problems in their capability. So I think that will make those responsibilities of leading economies, including the United States and China, even more important to initiate and to lead by example of making the Asia-Pacific region to much more integrated rather than fragmented and polarized.
I finish with a personal question because you've just returned from the APEC region yourself. You were in Indonesia and Australia. What are your takeaways from that experience, and what does that say about what the world wants from China, the United States, and the world that they shape?
Well, yeah, in the late October as well as the early November, I led a small group of SIS to visit Indonesia as well as Australia. And I had a chance to meet almost more than 100 scholars, officials of two countries. The main takeaways I had through the meetings with the scholars and officials of these two countries, they all expressed their strong desire for resuming the in-person dialogue and engagement between two sides. I mean, between Indonesia and China, between Australia and China. And also, they hope that more wider spectrums of those re-engagement, political, economic, cultural, and scholarly exchange should be revived, and to enhance the mutual understanding and to mitigate the misunderstanding. So this is the number one. The second takeaway I had is they all expressed the concerns about a ongoing geostrategic competition and even confrontation, head-on confrontation between Washington and Beijing, because I think that even if they have different priorities and their role and their partnership with the United States is quite different, as well as their relationship, their interests with China are different, but they all express the concerns of a head-on confrontation between the United States and China. And the third takeaway I had is, despite of the different interests and priorities of two countries regarding their respective relationship with China, they all believe that relationship with China are very important for these two countries' economic recovery and as well as prosperity in the long term. While there are many views among different think tanks and scholars in these two countries on how to deal with bilateral relationship between China and the United States, almost all of those people, scholars, officials I met, believe that the rise of China is inevitable, and any effort to contain China will not work. And they also believe that China's role would be more critical and important in shaping the regional and international order. So these are, I think, what impressed me most through my almost 2 weeks visits of these two countries.
Professor Chen Dongxiao from the Shanghai Institutes of International Studies, thank you very much for your time and for your insights.
Thank you. Thank you, James.
觉得还可以吧？
谢谢你，我不知道我还可以不可以。
做得很好，说得很好，对，谢谢。